Welcome to Keeping the Beat, an engaging web series hosted live by TNMEA in partnership with the CMA Foundation. Tune in weeknights, Monday through Thursday at 7 p.m. Central Time to learn from and interact with music professionals from around the globe representing every facet of the vast world of music. Today is Thursday, July 2nd, 2020. My name is Gene Kahng, and I serve as professor of violin at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville. Tonight, I will be talking to you about revisiting recording Florence Price, then and now. I encourage you to interact by replying to this live video stream with your questions and comments, which I will respond to throughout the hour. I will be both moderating as well as presenting, so please be patient with me as I take the time to switch between two roles. One disclaimer, while this is being streamed live, it will remain on the Keeping the Beat Facebook page for future reference. So as such, your comments will also remain a part of the archive. I will begin my presentation by first sharing my screen. As many of you know, Florence Price is considered the first African-American Black woman symphonic composer to have had her compositions performed by a major orchestra. She was a classical composer, pianist, and organist, and music teacher, and was born in 1887 in Little Rock, Arkansas, and passed away in Chicago in 1953. I first came across her works through a preservation project of my own design, intending to record two of her violin concertos, both which were never recorded, and the second, whose extant manuscript had only surfaced around 2010, though the existence of its concerto was always known. The manuscripts to those concertos reside at the Special Collections Library at the University of Arkansas, where I work. The CD was recorded in 2017, released in 2018. This presentation will be how I have personally experienced the wave of Price's fascination and interest amongst people outside of academic and musicological circles, including performers who often traverse both academic and industry circles, as well as a snapshot of where that has led me to today and the issues I continue to hold in tenuous balance. I have left ample time for Q&A at the end, so I hope that our time together will allow me to raise issues that perhaps resonate with your current reality, as well as raise questions for further elaboration and discussion. Here is a broad overview of themes I'd like to touch upon today, using my Florence Price recording project as a point of origin, as it marks a point of my commitment to anti-racism, which has only continued to evolve and deepen. I'd like to briefly share some of Florence Price's resources and speak about classical music's tenuous balance between tradition and innovation as it plays out in our modern recording practice. Next, I'd like to share and echo many of the sentiments I'm sure many of you have already thought of, which is to articulate some of the problems and challenges in the work we do as artists and teachers in our various industries and institutions moving forward. Here at the top, I've provided some Florence Price resources. In the month of August, the first inaugural Florence Price International Festival was scheduled to take place, which is now, of course, being held virtually due to COVID-19. I am on the advisory panel for the festival, so I can tell you that there are plans for weekly webinars, interviews, and performances, so please be on the lookout. You can access our schedule through the website, which I've listed here, but we also have a Facebook, Instagram, Twitter page as well. Jordan Smith, the second resource that I've shared here, is one of the founders of the festival and has compiled a list of resources on his blog. Though this is from 2018, the sources are still current, especially for those who are looking for a starting point. The biggest news for Florence Price fans is the publication of her biography, finally out in print via University of Illinois Press by Dr. Ray Linda Brown, which was out just last month. Dr. Brown is one of the preeminent scholars of Florence Price, and her tireless work on Black music and African American classical music has paved the way for so many of us who aim to continue this work. At the very bottom, I've also included here links to U of A's special collections where Price's primary resources and manuscripts can be found. And of course, right now, due to COVID-19, the library is closed, but they are still available by email, and PDFs are also available upon request, as well as Schirmer's general rental site, the very bottom, who has purchased the publishing rights to Price's catalog last year. I'd like to now take the opportunity to speak about recording Florence Price's 2 violin concerti. The recording is now 2 years old, and in some ways it has felt like no time has passed because I feel like the country has fortunately never stopped talking about her. But in some ways it has also felt like a decade has passed because I feel I've learned so much, and in turn so much has happened with our national and international conversations around Price and race and the state of classical music within the passing of those 2 short years. As I stated before, the project started in my own personal desire to learn more about Arkansan history and in my desire to know more about Florence Price, who I'll admit was completely an unknown name to me until about 2010. I think this was the beginning of me realizing how incomplete and how selective my knowledge of music history was. One of the most common questions I received early on regarding my recording project was, why Florence Price? It's an innocent question, of course, but as that question kept on being asked to me, what I heard was, what are the merits of recording Florence Price? As more time went along, I found myself distorting the question even further in my mind to, there are no great merits to Florence Price, so why are you recording her music? Speaking of then and now, I feel no one would really ask that question now. Maybe I'm wrong, but or at least not to the same degree that they asked 2 years ago, as we have seen a great interest in Florence Price's music and a lot more programming of her repertoire in the last 2 years. However, there's another variation to that question, which is, why are you recording Florence Price? The implication there being, why me and not someone else? To anyone who has embarked on any kind of recording project, you will know the decision to even do a recording, even the idea itself, requires moxie, a quality which must be nurtured even in the most headstrong of us. If we have come to value equality and diversity in what collective voices can bring, why is it that we seem to not value this as much in classical music? Personally, I would rather be in a library full of recordings from different artists than one or few recordings from, quote, the great masters. During my own preparations for the recording, I pushed myself through by realizing that the vision of a narrow recording world where only a few great masters would deserve to be heard is not actually the world that I myself might want to help support. I realized that as self-serving as it may have appeared at the time, or as it appears now, I wanted to work towards propping the closing elevator doors of our classical music world and create spaces for everyone, rather than being obsessed with running fast enough to slide into these elevator doors so that I could continue chasing others and learning how to squeeze through the cracks. Perhaps the other angle as well is why you, as in why you, an Asian American woman, performing Black music. To this, I admit I do not feel I have a sufficient set of answers because I am still navigating between the appearances and charges of cultural appropriation and ownership versus my own desires to continue to create inclusive spaces, and a desire and belief which has clearly allowed me to feel that I could be a possible candidate and a possible voice to amplify Price's strings works. Price's strings works were previously mostly read about, not usually performed with the same frequency as she appeared in history books. So I personally look forward to many other realizations of her concerto in the hands of other violinists in the coming years. All of these questions have continued to help me articulate and pursue the nature and meaning of true and deep and respectful allyship. In this slide, I took a moment to also outline traditional dichotomies and categories of recordings. Quote, academic recordings was the category I thought I'd be checking off when I first started this project, although as it went along, I started to again question what this category really meant. I assumed I was breaking the classic rule also in that I was not recording something that constituted the culmination of 1,000 performances where my crystallized interpretation was now, quote, ready to be published, since it was only the first one. It was by being forced to cross that bridge and to break the rules that I realized that there was in fact a perfectly viable world waiting for me on the other side. A world where academic recordings can be considered just as valuable and impactful and meaningful as commercial recordings. An interpretive statement that, when made in good faith, does not automatically assume that early statements are of lesser quality than those made later at a later stage. And finally, to realize how proficiently a classical work can speak to current themes and that perhaps we might not want music to be completely apolitical. Let me take a quick break to see if maybe there may be any questions. Feel free, by the way, as I'm speaking, to type in comments, questions, and I will try to get to them at natural pauses. For me, the belief that music is apolitical, with equal capacity for absoluteness, but ultimately a holder of specific set of beliefs, values, and cultures, has led me to think about all of the touch points I have as a performer and as a teacher in shaping the narrative of music. For the first time, I found myself truly interrogating what exactly has been passed down to me, to which I accepted without question, and what my role moving forward might look like in contrast. For the teachers tuning in tonight, it's no surprise that I have been considering ways that I might be able to restructure my own studio's curricula, realized in such things as repertoire choices and admission or audition criteria, for example. I say my own studio because instituting it in our own domain is clearly far easier and faster than what might need to happen on a departmental or institutional level. I have always wondered the ways in which the syllabi also, usually the first document our students see, can already reflect values of inclusiveness and anti-racism, where traditional classical music has always been about centralized values and a general top-down model of hierarchy. A long-standing goal of mine has been to always house music and the study of performance in a broader humanities context. If we see music as a cultural product, I don't see how it's possible for music to avoid or otherwise be separated from the challenges toward equality and equity of society, from which the society in which it's born. My commitments of late are to make sure that I do not try to shy away from those conversations and do not overlook the problematic context in which some of our favorite music may have been housed. Because honestly, as difficult as it may be to educate oneself on these issues, I've found it even more challenging and difficult to know how exactly to talk about it and how exactly to take action to respond to it. This leads me to my next column, which I've come to believe in re-examining the way in which we might bring ourselves to be present for difficult conversations and making ourselves available for all avenues of those conversations to be invited. The list I have is an incomplete one, but one where I've tried to outline possibilities of conversations ranging from purely professional settings to discussions we might have with our closest family and friends. Finally, even though we as performers are often driven by a myriad of equally essential and necessary actions and factors, I have taken some time to do some thinking exercises in what kinds of thematic programming has taken place and what are things we might want to continue to nurture as an industry and what things might be in need to be updated, revamped, and overhauled in some cases. One of the things I've been thinking about is a sentiment I've heard where people will say, Audiences don't want to feel like they're in a lecture hall when they attend concerts. They often buy tickets for the chance to hear their favorite pieces. This makes a lot of sense to me, of course, but I would also argue that audiences do, in fact, want to learn something new, and the opportunity to hear something for the first time is often a fond memory of ours in the first experiences we recollect with falling in love with a particular piece of music. To bring this kind of experience to audiences, however, we first have to be willing to walk that road ourselves as researchers and performers. Learning something new will often entail actually relearning something old, which inevitably brings a certain degree of baggage. For the longest time, especially dealing with classical history, I had this simple notion that there was a single narrative in history, a singular perspective, and therefore, once the story and facts were learned, they never needed to be re-examined through another lens, because in my mind, another lens didn't exist. I feel I was quite late in realizing that the history we may have been taught in our history books did not represent a unanimous view of reality for everyone, and that it deserved a more careful reading, and a reading that I should be prepared to revisit many times during my lifetime. That reading can come through books, reaching understanding through critical thinking, through empathy, through engaging in deep conversations with your professional and interpersonal networks, as we just mentioned, taking the time to continue to invest time and energy in nurturing those relationships, and being committed to the development and pursuit of your own values. Here, I list some examples of networks that may serve as pillars of support, strength, and learning. This entails equal parts listening and sharing. In regards to the sharing part, we've undoubtedly by now seen many musicians who are crafting digital concerts, some even at-home recitals with varying degrees of formality. With this comes the question of how polished these performances are expected to be, either from the musician's perspective or the audience's perspective. And I can tell you that I have personally struggled with the tension between sharing performances that are super polished and perfect versus sharing performances that I know are less than polished, but are shared in the spirit of community and immediacy. I have really enjoyed seeing my musician friends exercise their vulnerability and courage in putting their works out there into the digital sphere in support of music, their causes, a sense of digital community, and to make a statement. It has taught me, much like putting myself out there with Florence Price's recording, that music at its heart is a communal activity whose message of solidarity, healing, and togetherness sometimes gets lost in our pursuit of an astringent and clinical sense of perfection. This isn't to create a false correlation between at-home music and lowered standards. In other words, I have been deeply moved by the at-home music recordings with ambient noise, barking pets, lawnmowers, and cracked notes in some cases that have been not perfect, quote, not perfect in the traditional understanding of that word. It has reminded me that somehow along the way we have developed this possibly toxic love for perfection, both in reifying it in our music as well as finding comfort in constantly confirming that we will never be worthy to truly own perfection ourselves. And we then teach this to our students in the repertoire we choose, and of course the repertoire that we discard, in the way that we talk about music, the way that we teach the music devoid of its cultural and historical context, and opt instead to exalt these dissociated products of self-made geniuses and masters. In the past, due to my experiences with Florence Price, I have apologetically introduced some of her music into my curricula as personal add-ons. I have come to realize that feeling the need to apologize for my choices to, quote, interrupt the regularly scheduled curricula to insert composers like Florence Price was, in my own way, replicating and reinforcing racial hierarchy. All the while, I could let myself off the hook by feeling good about, quote, diversifying my own curricula. I have come to realize that this wasn't good enough, at least not by my standards. No apologies were needed, no need to make demarcations or parentheses. But this is what happens when we operate in systems and institutions with racial hierarchies that can often avoid the conversation by claiming color blindness and, quote, a pursuit of excellence, which is, of course, drenched with racist values. Simply denying its existence will not eradicate racism. It must be discussed and acknowledged openly and must filter into everything we do, which of course includes our music. I'd like to take the next couple of slides to share some loosely related sentiments and observations, much of which will seem aphoristic. And some of these slides are addressed in the second person. It's not my intent to speak to or speak on behalf of anyone's experiences but my own. My hope is that they resonate with you in some way, and in the spirit of community, that we can perhaps discuss or raise questions and discuss these, and they're certainly not intended as directives. It took me a long while to see my own platform and privilege. Not being born in this country, witnessing, being a part of the tough immigration story of my own parents, my own efforts to assimilate as best as possible, and witnessing my own experiences of racism and discrimination over the years had blinded me to the platform and privilege I truly possess as a violinist, as a university professor, and also as an Asian American. Personally, the biggest fear I've had to overcome was to face the feeling of vulnerability and harm that may come my way by sticking out and speaking up. With a lifetime of practice in hiding and appeasing, it's been very difficult to know now how to show up for others. I think it is assumed that exercising courage is just a simple decision, and maybe in some ways it is. It certainly is a commitment. But exercising it is also a skill that involves experience and practice, as well as an experience that requires trust and strength, which must be built gradually. So all of this to say, give yourself as many chances to practice your courage. Take the time to recognize your own power, and take the time to check back in with your own purpose and values. After the Florence Price recording caught national attention, to my complete surprise, I was overwhelmed with many who now understood my new identity to be that of a Price scholar and expert. I resisted the categorization and still feel undeserving of this title. It made me interrogate who and what an expert is. In my mind, an expert is first and foremost a scholar and not a performer. Experts are also people who wear tweed jackets and have published for decades. Because I didn't fit these self-proclaimed checkboxes, I suffered from an overwhelming sense of imposter syndrome. At the risk again of sounding self-serving, I'd like to present a different set of criteria for your consideration, decentralizing the idea of expert. I'm not trying to minimize, of course, the scholars who have dedicated their entire lives to knowledge creation and transmission, but more along the lines of making space for others who express desires to contribute to growing bodies of knowledge and knowledge transmission and sharing it with others. It simply acknowledges the growth process of scholarship rather than the trophy or title that is being given to scholars at the end as a point of arrival. And if this is the case, that people's desires to contribute are first taken in good faith, that ultimately our resource of which to draw upon the expertise of people are judged by the quality in which we make space for everyone, build bridges, invite conversation, and build community. Against the traditional definitions of expertise, I'd like to propose a more egalitarian model where every voice has something to contribute, and the process and growth-oriented nature of knowledge and scholarship is also recognized. Since the publishing of Price's recording, I've had a chance to renew my commitment to service. The time since the recording, 2 years, has allowed me to see what is truly at stake, what is truly possible, and also a taste of what it will truly involve in terms of sustained quality and weight of emotional labor, learning, courage, nurturing of existing and new relationships, and the continued development and practice of one's values. I grew up and was taught under the belief and absoluteness of music. It was a pretty easy connection, honestly, for me to make because much of our literature doesn't contain words, which can often immediately politicize or at least concretize music's otherwise abstractness. I've come to realize how, in fact, for me, nothing is free from politics. This also means that for me, nothing is truly free from the work of social justice and anti-racism. Personally, it has been interesting to make distinctions between guilt and responsibility. Though we may not be personally be guilty of the actions of our ancestors, we are certainly responsible, in my mind, to fight for a more equitable world. This is a variation on the previous slide of service, a series of commitments to raise the people in my circle up as best as I am able. I'm committed to helping people see and recognize their greatness, to gather their strength and courage, to also remind them frequently and often how much I love them, how much they matter. Lastly, for people like me who has had the privilege to not have to defend myself from active harm, the privilege to avoid such confrontations, to think ahead and to think now about a series of tools and strategies I might employ to actively interrupt harm I may experience in the future or harm that I may witness others experiencing, to speak up, to not wait, and to not turn away. Another related slide along the lines of offering help and service is taking the time to consider what my best model of allyship will look like for me, and knowing that it may change in how it manifests over time. I know for me, I have been spending time thinking about how to develop a language around collective labor, to face false assumptions, and to continue to push outward and expand my vision of truth and reality by both seeking allies, but also learning how to be an ally for others. I'd like to conclude by saying that my daily role consists of teaching and performing from the very canon that I have come to question and no longer consider acceptable on its own. In response, I have been thinking and discussing how to reframe and, in some cases, deframe our existing curricula and offer instead one that is fervently anti-racist. I hope with some of the things I have shared today that many of you will feel convinced to join me for the true journey that I have felt recording Florence Price then and now is that I am no longer able to support and no longer willing to simply pass down and transmit a tradition that so many, including myself, have been the object, have considered the music of which I have had deepest admiration and a tradition which I have grown to love so deeply. The remaining slides here are a small sampling of resources to organizations, blogs, publishers, and readings. The list is not comprehensive, but it is also a list that I was able to compile quite quickly, which hopefully shows you how, unlike in years prior, there is a lot more access, visibility, and interest to know more and to share knowledge around previously excluded literature. There are still huge barriers to accessibility of music and visibility of resources, however, so I hope that this trend of materials and resources being more prominent and easy to access continues to develop. These resources, if anyone is interested, is about 3 slides long. Finally, I've listed my email address here for any comments and discussions and questions anyone may have tonight and would like to reach out for further discussion at a later time. But I'm also going to look at the questions list now to see if there may be any discussions or questions or points that I've raised that I can further elaborate at this time. Thank you, Chelsea. I will read the questions. Chelsea asks, what do you think has influenced the resurgence of interest in Florence Price's works? Why were her works relatively unknown? I am embarrassed that I did not learn about her in music school. So I'll address these, I guess, in random order. I just want to chime in and also say that I never learned about Florence Price in my music history courses. I was also embarrassed to realize, or embarrassed and shocked maybe even, to realize that Florence Price was often historically tagged with William Grant Still, who was a figure who is featured in Grout. Grout being at least one standard textbook that I know a lot of musicologists use in introducing Music 101 to music majors and music non-majors. And his Afro-American Symphony, of course, is also, I think, included in the kind of Grout CD from which a lot of students have to study as an emblematic work. So that, to be honest, was another specific question. Why is it that William Grant Still, her classmate, they were in the same class, they grew up together, their families knew each other, made it into the history books, but not her? The best answer I can give is this is just an example of how exclusive history is, and perhaps even the very real challenges of time constraint that a 15-week school semester will often present. How is it possible to include 1,000 years of music in a 15-week semester? And okay, maybe these music history curricula may span a year or two. 30, 60 weeks, even at its maximum, 4 years, how can we actually do justice to music history? The way in which it's been presented has always been sort of cherry picking the quote best parts, which by nature will always exclude people. And so the very nature of the time constraint, which may be an innocent limitation, also kind of interfaces with value judgments, which again may be subconscious but are not divorced from racial biases, gender biases. I don't know why she was not included. At some point, whoever curated our history of music history decided that there was no room to include her. In terms of how the recording project came to be and her manuscripts, a lot of it was unknown. And again, this to me presents another vision of how history is made. So much of history which is accessible also involves a huge team of editors who are contemporaries of composers during the time who can successfully advocate for people. Editors, publishers, supporters, organizations, performers who give voice to composers. Although Florence Price was part of a thriving community of artists and poets, literary artists, dancers, it was very much a segregated society. And so within that power dynamic and with that distinction, I think comes also economic disparity. And with that economic and racial disparity, basically the cost of that is exposure. She was unknown because she was considered unimportant during her time, even with her accolades. And then upon her death, there was no one to really advocate for her. Her daughter donated the first installment of manuscripts to the U of A, University of Arkansas, in the late 1970s. But there was a lot of other loose leaf papers and manuscripts which remained uncatalogued. The second installment of her manuscripts, which the U of A received around 2009, 2010, was made fortuitously by a couple who came to purchase her old Chicago home, which was left abandoned actually for quite some time. Therefore, because it was abandoned for a long time, it had quite a bit of damage, including roof damage, which allowed rain and the elements to take hold of the paper that people used, obviously, to compose at the time, which had extensive mold damage. Her home was also ransacked, and obviously the papers were left because they were of no visible value to the robbers. It also meant that literally a tornado had gone through the house. Extensive mold damage, extensive pages still missing from her manuscripts, and no one really now surviving to really be a credible source. And this is also the interesting challenge of recreating history, which is how do we give authentic voice and integrity to someone's legacy when the people who can best vouch for it are no longer surviving, and the people who could have been there to vouch for her during that time were unable or unwilling to do so. So I think that maybe addresses the unknown aspect of it, also the kind of curation in our music curricula. The last part of your question, Chelsea, the resurgence, I can only hope that now there is renewed interest, perhaps because there are so many voices now speaking to the incompleteness of history. And there are so many advocates now that we see in large numbers who have seen the importance and the value in speaking to really getting at the heart of collecting what the reality and the truth of our history has been, the things that we've taught, the things that we've inherited, and to participate in a healthy questioning of and a healthy task to re-articulate our values. That is going to be my hope for why there has been a resurgence. All of us, many of us work in institutions that have also, I think, incentivized, for lack of a better umbrella term, diversity and inclusion and equity and access. It's easy to be cynical about that, but if the byproduct of that incentivizing has been also that larger corporations and institutions now have been more willing to jump on board, then I say great. But I would say there have been a large number of historians and scholars and members of the public and performers and composers who have always been interested. Maybe it has just taken a really long time, and maybe now is the time that we are finally able to address these head on. Just a quick insertion before I go to the next question, which is I have worked also with a feminist musicologist who first wrote about Florence Price in the 1970s. She actually lives in Fayetteville, Arkansas, and during my project, I had a chance to work with her, and I asked her this very question, which is, why do you think she has become so popular now? And she did not, Barbara Garvey Jackson did not really have a successful answer other than to say, I don't know, because in my own field, I have been fascinated with her since the 1970s. She has so much research and articles that have been published on Florence Price, which anyone can access who has university access to her journals and articles. But you can also see that there have been these hotspots of publications, and then there's sort of a drop off. It was sort of included in these academic journals, which never kind of made it into the public sphere. And then it just abruptly stops. There's almost no publication in her particular field on it. And sort of there's these smatterings of it. So long story short, maybe now is the time. Certainly, I have been able to connect with a lot more people via the internet, and have been able to realize that there are pockets of people working in all sort of spheres of the globe on Florence Price and or general issues of anti-racism in classical music. But it has been so much easier now to connect via social media, via technology. So maybe it's also a facet of our time, the modern time that we live in. Chelsea, you have a follow-up question. How do you approach incorporating cultural, societal, and historical context when teaching repertoire to your students? In fairness, I haven't really had a chance to exercise it in the way that I really would like to see myself doing. As I was saying in the presentation, I've always kind of just sort of said, oh, here's some Florence Price pieces you might be interested in incorporating, in addition to your Mozart concerto, in addition to your Bach solo sonatas and partitas. And because people in my immediate community here are aware of my work, I think they've been willing, let's say, in the worst case scenarios, willing to tolerate me throwing repertoire at them. I think in the best case scenario, it's been met with a lot of relief, in the sense of, thank you so much for introducing repertoire of people who look like me. I have a lot of students and people in the community who have lived and grown up in Arkansas. And it's been really comforting to know that there is a larger impact to my work, because again, as a classical musician, I often wonder, am I just sort of screaming into the void at times, or I don't know, maybe even worse, just screaming at each other in this small void that we all encompass. And to know that classical music can still make an impact upon people who may have not grown up with the tradition, and see the value in representation, has been really, really comforting. What I plan to do, regardless of online or in-person or hybrid teaching forms next semester, is to honestly overhaul my entire curricula. And I've been spending my summer actually talking to other, specifically in my field, violinists, about how to incorporate existing curricula, some of which, because I work for a state institution, is state mandated, but also in exercising my own freedom, right? Because I have been employed to exercise my own expertise in violin performance, and I have been given a certain degree of academic freedom to practice how that's going to be exactly manifested in my studio. I definitely want to start out with contextualizing repertoire. So if there are certain repertoire and certain composers of that repertoire who have encompassed challenging historical times, and or in some situations have housed, let's face it, really racist values, I planned to address those head on. I planned to disassociate this idea of music being able or being at its best when it doesn't address those issues. Classical music, I suppose, can be enjoyed by everyone, but I think it can be enjoyed and appreciated when it is not disassociated from, as I was saying in the presentation, the society from which it's born. And society is always filled with challenges. And I think it's a disservice if we try to somehow pretend that it is this magical, transfigured object that is above it all. I know that's a really, really vague answer, but that's as far as I've gotten in terms of how I choose to address it in future years. On a very, very practical level, I'm also very thankful for Google Docs. Again, not endorsing or sponsoring them, but just in terms of shared documents, the availability of shared documents, in the sense that it's allowed me to connect with a lot of other violin teachers who are now sharing specific violin repertoire that's both graded, so that we can talk about how we can introduce it to young violinists who are just starting out, as well as repertoire by genre. What are the duo literature? What's the violin concerti literature? What's the string quartet literature? As well as readings, and as well as playlists and recordings. So it's a pretty comprehensive list I'll just put it out there. If anyone else is interested in violin-specific literature, please email me. I will be happy to share it. It's a collective document that, again, as I was saying about decentralizing expertise, I think it's made better by the fact that it's been shared widely and people are able to contribute their own pieces of knowledge to it. Shane, thank you. Shane asks, how does your race play into the music that you perform? Is race in music something that we are inseparable from? Yeah, to be honest with you, I'm also dealing with this as well, right? As I was speaking about in the presentation, recognizing my own privilege as an Asian American woman has been difficult because I didn't see it. I was so caught up in my own struggles that I did not see it for the longest time. Before I was coming even to Florence Price, I was thinking about, well, I grew up in the time of the LA riots, and it's now been 20-something years since the LA riots. And I was telling a friend that I feel only now, after about 20 years, I'm at a place emotionally maybe to revisit some of the unresolvable feelings that I felt I was assaulted with, but didn't quite know how to deal with. So for those who may be wondering what I mean, there were the LA riots, of course. There was the Rodney King beating, and I thought, oh my gosh, it's so tragic that I was only speaking to a friend about the Rodney King beating, in which a person with a camcorder was able to video record the beating, the mass beating of Rodney King in central LA. And that, as you can imagine, incited a lot of rage and anger because there was a lot of other situations that were happening right in LA. Another one is the Rampart police drug scandal, where police were found to have been planting drugs in a predominantly black neighborhood. The other was the shooting and killing of Latasha Harlan's, a 15-year-old teenage girl who was, quote, stealing orange juice. She was shot down by a Korean liquor store owner in Koreatown, but upon trial was let off with something like 10,000 hours of community service. To be honest with you, that was the first time I had to confront direct feelings of shame about being Korean American. Again, as I was speaking about it in the presentation, how I needed to articulate the difference between guilt and responsibility. Of course, I wasn't the one who shot this teenage girl, but I felt so responsible. And I lived very close to Koreatown, and it made me, I still have unresolved feelings about it. I still don't quite know how I feel about it or how to digest those emotions, I guess. So I feel like only now, 20 years later, I'm at a place where I'm still dealing with it. I'm trying to speak with a lot of friends who also came of age during that time. I try to resolve some of it in the music that I play. And I think that my interest in social justice and anti-racism has always been simmering in the background. And the ways in which I try to deal with my own racial identity has in some ways fit in quite well with this wish for social justice and to see a different, equitable world. But in some ways it also has been odds against it, because as you know, so many ethnic groups experience so much infighting as well as fighting between the groups where they're so divisive. I don't know if I'm addressing actually any of your questions, Shane, but all of that to say, yes, race definitely plays a part. I think I briefly touched upon it and didn't really have a chance to delve into it deeper, but the issues also of cultural appropriation, right? When people who do not know me and who do not know my work first encounter a performance of mine or are aware of my interests in Florence Price, many have later on come to confess and tell me, yeah, to be completely honest with you, when I first met you or when I first heard you, I thought, an Asian woman playing black music. What's going on there? And many, of course, have come around to know my story and to know kind of the context behind it. But I find that that immediate feeling is a pretty common one. And it's the fact that it's so common attests to, again, these simple kind of racial shorthands that we have maybe fallen prey to. I don't know. That to say that, for me, I still don't quite know how to know the place between accepting that a culture may not be mine, but that I still may be invited to support and have a space for advocacy, which is, of course, my intent with performing Florence Price. I would like to think, finally, in addressing the issue of race, of being an Asian American woman, that it affords me deeper understanding. Korean Americans in general experienced an influx to the US in the 1970s. And so our struggle with how to assimilate and how to accommodate, how to aspire to the dominant white culture and to disappear. And on the contrast, on the flip side to that, how to continue to pay homage to our Korean heritage in America is a pretty raw and ongoing conversation. And that's not to say that other ethnic groups of East Asian origin, like Chinese or Japanese, for example, do not experience this. But that's only just to say, statistically, from what I understand, there are a lot more fourth or fifth generation Chinese Americans who, for example, may not even speak the language, who may not have any awareness to China or connection to China in a way that I find would be rarer for Korean Americans. So this constant tension between assimilation and adoption and homage and selling out are things that constantly play out even in a non-musical setting. And I find, again, with music not being able to be completely apolitical, I find that those conversations definitely find a musical equivalent when we enter a space like classical music, which by its origins is Western European. So hopefully that answers the question. Shane, thank you. In what ways do you recommend we combat racism in classical music? Of course, I have no quick answers to this. And at the same time, maybe the things I will say are also things that you have already heard. I think the best way to combat racism in classical music is the ways in which we might combat racism in general, which is, and I hate to list this off as if it's so easy, but education and re-education through a lot of conversation, and to ask a lot of questions and to question your assumptions. Those are just some quick things that I have been personally thinking about. Before this, I was even talking with a friend saying, in some ways, at being an educator, I find that actually, ordering a bunch of books and reading about our history and absorbing all these resources, listening to a lot of music, in some ways is the easy part. And of course, that is not easy, right? But what I find the most difficult is actually how to talk about it and how to put it into practice. What does it mean to be aware of something, and what does it mean to actually translate that into action that makes a difference? And again, that goes back to one of the slides, I think, which is to question what deep allyship would look like for you. I find that to be something that is a deeply personal question, as it is also hopefully a common question that people are asking, and also a question that I know many people have opinions on how that will look. But for me, I feel like I'm still at the beginning stages, which is why I was also alluding to the imposter syndrome, which is, I think the values that I hold have always been simmering in the background in my upbringing, but the ways in which I've found different channels to manifest it have certainly been new. And the ways in which I choose to practice it and help others, and to also help myself, it's constantly changing. So it's difficult, and it continues to evolve. as I become more comfortable speaking up and standing up, I was about to say for others, but also again traversing that line that I don't speak for others, but that I do advocate and support others in their efforts to be heard. So those are some of the things that at least I'm trying to do in combating racism. Chelsea, thank you so much. Are there other particular composers you intend to do further research on? Yes. Again, going back to this Google Doc that I was speaking about, Rachel Barton Pine Foundation, Rachel Barton Pine herself as a violinist, has been quite invested in African American and Black composers. So she is someone who, for example, anyone who is interested in the violin world can access. So I definitely plan to revisit some of her composers that she's both published and helped publish and record. But actually, one thing that I'm thinking about, and I was alluding to this earlier, is for me, in addition to focusing on composers and people, I'm actually now becoming more interested in how to reframe the conversation we have around music. So in other words, I feel like there is a way to talk about being anti-racist and being an advocate for unheard voices, even when talking about Mozart, for example. So it's not so much who is heard, although obviously that's also important, but also how do we re-understand and reframe the people that we think we already know? So to me, I suppose that's almost like a step back in terms of perspective, in that I'm not zooming in with particular people and composers and their corpus, their body of work, but also dealing with the ways in which we understand and assume ideas around greatness and genius and whiteness, to be honest, which I find is much more systemic, right? One of the articles that I've posted as part of the resources talks about the fact that diversifying our repertoire as educators, while it's a really important step, is ultimately unsuccessful because it's like an add-on, as I was saying. If I'm teaching Bach and Mozart and Beethoven, and not to knock those composers, I love all three of those composers. But if we introduce those three composers in the repertoire that we've grown up with being trained as violinists, but then we kind of just throw in Florence Price, yes, it's helpful, but it ends up, at least to me, kind of like, oh, let's just sort of make an honorary place for her. And I feel also the criteria with which we judge greatness, it's an unfair game, because then she, as you may have also seen in some literature, gets compared to Dvorak and Tchaikovsky. It's not an even playing field. So I guess all of that to say, I'm very interested in doing the work to do my best to even out the playing field on a systemic level. And again, that's not to say that diversifying and introducing new composers is not doing that, but I do find that the context and the frame with which these composers are taught is now my new renewed interest. So those are all the questions I have received. I will renew it one more time. Thank you so much. So now I think it's my time to close out and read the end script. Tune in weeknights, Mondays, Tuesdays, and Thursdays at 7 Central Time to watch Keeping the Beat live, and remember to tell your friends about the program. The next program will be next Monday, July 6th at 7 p.m. Central Time, featuring Jasmine Fripp. I highly encourage you, if you haven't already, to read her open letter titled, With Love, Letters to My Fellow White Music Colleagues. Presenters who wish to apply to host an episode should send applications via tnmea.org. Thanks for watching.